Emotional needs weren't just unmet for avoidance, they were often treated like liabilities. Many avoidants grew up in environments where expressing emotion was discouraged, dismissed, or even punished. If they cried, they were told to stop being dramatic. If they got excited, they were told to calm down. If they felt sad or scared, they were ignored or made to feel like a burden. Over time, they got the message loud and clear. Having feelings makes you vulnerable, and being vulnerable invites rejection, shame, or chaos. So they learn to bury those feelings, to suppress their needs, to rely only on themselves, not because they wanted to be independent, but because dependence felt dangerous. It meant putting their emotional well-being into someone else's hands, a risk they weren't willing to take again. The tragedy is that many avoidants don't even realize they have needs until much later in life. They've been so conditioned to disconnect from their emotional world that they don't know what they need or how to express it. Their self-reliance becomes so automatic, so deeply ingrained, that even asking for help feels foreign. They might minimize their struggles, downplay their pain, or convince themselves they're fine when they're not. And when someone tries to offer them care, they often don't know how to receive it. Kindness can feel uncomfortable. Attention can feel suspicious. Nurturing can feel suffocating. Not because they don't want it, but because it challenges everything they've taught themselves to believe about safety and emotional survival. This creates a painful paradox. Avoidants want connection, but they've trained themselves not to need it. They want to be supported, but they're afraid to depend on anyone. They long for intimacy, but they don't trust it. So they remain in a kind of emotional limbo, where they deny their own needs in order to feel secure, but then feel isolated and empty because those needs are never met. It's a cycle that reinforces itself. The more they avoid expressing needs, the more disconnected they feel. The more disconnected they feel, the harder it becomes to let anyone in, and eventually the belief sets in that maybe they're just better off alone, not because they want to be alone, but because it feels like the only way to protect themselves. If avoidants could put words to this experience, they'd likely say, "I learned early that my feelings didn't matter, that needing someone meant getting let down or worse, made to feel weak. So I stopped needing, I stopped asking, I stopped hoping someone would care." They didn't become distant because they're cold-hearted. They became distant because somewhere along the way they got hurt deeply enough that shutting down felt safer than reaching out. They buried their needs because expressing them once led to pain, and that pain left a mark. Even now, as adults, the idea of showing vulnerability stirs those same fears, not just of being hurt again, but of being seen as too much, or not enough, or fundamentally unlovable because of their emotional world. But no one can truly thrive without emotional connection. Even the most independent person needs to feel seen, understood, and valued. Avoidants are no exception. Beneath the layers of self-protection is a person who still longs for what they were once denied: unconditional care, safe support, and the freedom to have needs without shame. They don't need fixing. They need the safety to unlearn what never should have been taught in the first place, that needing love is somehow a weakness. Avoidants are not broken people who need to be repaired. They are individuals who adapted to emotional pain the only way they knew how, by protecting themselves. Their avoidance isn't a flaw in their character, it's a survival mechanism. What looks like coldness is often resilience. What looks like detachment is often the result of years spent trying to stay emotionally safe. When you see an avoidant pulling away, what you're witnessing isn't someone who lacks love. It's someone who learned, through experience, that love was unpredictable, unsafe, or conditional. And because of that, They had to develop a way to function that didn't rely on anyone else. Their self-sufficiency may appear strong, even admirable on the surface, but underneath, it often masks a deep history of emotional neglect, disappointment, or abandonment. Avoidants aren't immune to feelings. In fact, they often feel more than they let on. But somewhere along the line, they learned that expressing those feelings only brought pain, judgment, or chaos. So they shut them down. They buried their needs and emotions so deeply that even they may have lost touch with them. They told themselves stories to justify their emotional distance. I don't need anyone. I'm better off alone. Love just isn't for me. But those are not truths. They are defense mechanisms. They are shields built around unhealed wounds, and behind those shields are people who want to feel safe, connected, and loved just like anyone else. The problem is, the very walls that once kept them safe are now keeping them isolated, and many avoidants don't even realize it. They've become so used to operating from a place of self-protection that vulnerability feels like danger, not growth. Emotional closeness triggers alarms that were installed long ago. This is too much. You'll get hurt again. You'll lose control. These internal warnings are not signs of dysfunction. They're signs of a nervous system that adapted to emotional threat. They're signs of someone who never got to experience love as something consistent and nurturing, only as something conditional, intense, or even absent. So when avoidants pull back in relationships, it's rarely because they don't care. More often, it's because they care deeply but don't know how to engage without feeling overwhelmed. They're afraid of being seen too clearly and judged. They're afraid of being depended on, of being responsible for someone else's emotional well-being, or of being abandoned the moment they let their guard down. These fears don't make them broken. They make them human. They make them someone who was shaped by their past, not defined by it. Healing for an avoidant doesn't come through pressure. It doesn't come from being told to just open up or stop pushing people away. That only reinforces the fear that their emotions are too much, that their internal experience is somehow wrong. What they need is safety. They need space to slowly test what it feels like to be vulnerable and still accepted. They need to be reminded again and again that emotional closeness doesn't have to mean self-betrayal. That intimacy doesn't have to equal loss of control. That love can be steady, present, and real. And perhaps most importantly, avoidants need compassion for themselves and from others. Because learning to love and be loved after a lifetime of self-protection is incredibly brave work. It requires not just insight, but courage. It requires the willingness to sit with discomfort, to unlearn old stories, and to try again in moments when everything inside them says retreat. But avoidants are capable of that work. They have the strength to heal not because they were broken to begin with, but because they were hurt, and healing is what hurt people deserve. If you love someone with avoidant tendencies, understand this. Their distance is not rejection. It's a form of emotional self-preservation. It's the echo of a time when love wasn't safe, when closeness felt like threat. They are not broken. They are still protecting wounds they never asked to receive. But under those defenses is someone who wants to be known, who wants to trust, who wants to love in a way that feels free and full. And if they could speak that truth out loud, without fear, without shame, you'd finally understand that their avoidance was never about not caring. It was about never feeling safe enough to show how deeply they do. If avoidance could speak, they would tell you that the silence you experience from them is not a punishment. It's not indifference. It's not manipulation. It's not a game. The silence is their shield. It's the way they've learned to survive a world that once felt emotionally unsafe. When they shut down or pull away, it's not because they don't care, but because they care so deeply that it terrifies them. It threatens to expose an old wound, a hidden ache that they've carried for so long that even they struggle to put words to it. They learned early, sometimes before they even had language, that reaching out, showing emotion, or needing someone could result in pain. That lesson didn't come through logic. It came through experience. It came from crying out as a child and no one coming. From being scolded for expressing sadness. From being made to feel that their emotional world was too much, too messy, or simply unimportant. So they began to build a wall, not because they wanted to shut people out, but because they didn't know how else to stay safe. When people assume avoidants are cold, uncaring, or distant, they miss the truth. Avoidants are often highly sensitive individuals who have armored themselves because life taught them that being open was dangerous. The silence is the sound of someone bracing for impact. It's the sound of someone hoping to be loved, while fearing they'll be misunderstood, criticized, or abandoned all over again. They're not trying to hurt you. They're trying not to be hurt again. When avoidants disconnect, it often happens in the moments that matter most. After a fight, after a moment of intimacy, after a vulnerable conversation, that's when their inner alarms go off. Their body tightens, their breath shortens. Their mind starts racing with fears they don't always understand. Am I getting too close? Will I lose myself again? Will they leave if they see the real me? These fears weren't planted yesterday. They've been growing for years, maybe decades. So when they go quiet, it's not a conscious rejection. It's an automatic response, one that kicks in long before they even have time to process their own emotions. They might not be able to tell you what they're feeling, not because they don't want to, but because they've been out of touch with their own needs for so long that those feelings show up as fog, as tension, or simply as the need to get away. Avoidants often carry guilt they don't speak about. They know their silence hurts the people who care about them. They can see the confusion in your eyes, hear the sadness in your voice, feel the distance grow between you. And deep down it eats at them, but they don't know how to change it without putting themselves in a vulnerable position that once felt like drowning. So they convince themselves that staying quiet is safer, that people are better off without the messy parts of them, that disappearing is more humane than staying and struggling to connect. But if they could speak, really speak from the part of them that's been buried under fear, they'd tell you they want to be close. They'd tell you they long for connection, that their silence is not the absence of love, but the echo of wounds that haven't been healed. This is what makes relationships with avoidants so confusing for those who love them. On the surface, it can feel like they don't care. But the truth is, they care so much it overwhelms them. Underneath the silence is a storm of conflicting emotions: love, fear, hope, shame, longing, confusion. They don't push you away because you're unworthy. They pull away because they've never learned how to let someone stay. Because somewhere along the way, love became something to fear. And now, even when it shows up in healthy, consistent, caring ways, they question it. They test it. They retreat from it not to punish you, but to protect the tender, unhealed parts of themselves. In that silence is a plea: please don't give up on me. Please don't take my distance as a verdict on your worth. Please understand that I'm trying, even when it looks like I'm not, that I'm scared. Not cruel, that I'm frozen, not heartless. Avoidants don't speak this out loud because many of them have never had the language for it. They've spent so long burying their emotions, downplaying their needs, pretending everything is fine, that even admitting to themselves that they're scared feels like weakness. But it's not weakness, it's humanity. If you're someone who loves an avoidant, you've probably felt the sting of their silence. You've probably asked yourself what you did wrong. You may have tried harder, leaned in closer, only to be met with more distance. That's not your fault, and it's not theirs either. It's the product of an emotional blueprint that taught them love equals risk, vulnerability equals danger, and silence equals safety. But even in that silence, there's hope, because silence isn't permanent, it's not a dead end, it's a pause. And in that pause, there's the potential for healing if both people are willing to be patient, compassionate, and brave. Avoidants don't need fixing. They need understanding. They need to feel that it's safe to come out from behind the wall. They need to experience love not as pressure, but as presence, not as demand, but as gentle invitation. If they could speak, truly speak, they'd tell you that behind the silence is a heart that wants to be known, but fears it won't be accepted. They'd tell you they're trying to unlearn a lifetime of defenses, that they're scared, yes, but also willing if only they felt it was safe. And in hearing those words, not from anger but from tenderness, you'd finally understand. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, closeness does not feel like comfort the way it might for others. It doesn't automatically register as warmth, safety, or belonging. Instead, it can feel like pressure, like danger, like something closing in on them that they can't quite name but instinctively want to escape from. This reaction isn't logical, it's emotional. It's often rooted in early life experiences where intimacy was inconsistent, overwhelming, or conditional. Maybe love was given, but then quickly taken away. Maybe caregivers were physically present, but emotionally unavailable. Or maybe being close to someone meant being responsible for their emotions, or constantly monitoring one's own behavior to avoid being shamed or rejected. Over time, closeness began to feel less like a source of peace and more like a setup for pain. So when someone gets too close, when emotions start to rise, or when a relationship starts to feel serious, avoidants may begin to withdraw not out of malice, but out of instinct. Their body tells them to pull back, to breathe, to make space, not because they don't care, but because the closeness is stirring something within them that feels out of control. It's waking up fears they've spent years trying to suppress. Fear of being smothered, fear of losing their independence, fear of being emotionally overrun, and sometimes even fear of being seen too deeply, of having their inner world exposed in ways that might lead to rejection or shame. They might start to nitpick, to focus on flaws, or to convince themselves the relationship isn't right after all. Not because they actually believe the connection is flawed, but because creating emotional distance provides a sense of control. They are trying to regain footing in a situation that feels too intense, too vulnerable. Love, for them, often feels like a wave that's too big to stand against, so instead of riding it, they retreat to the shore. They retreat to solitude, to distraction, to emotional detachment. It's not a reflection of how little they care. It's a reflection of how much they fear what caring might cost them. To an avoidant, intimacy can trigger the body's stress response. Their nervous system reacts as if closeness is a threat to their autonomy and safety. They might feel trapped even in a kind, nurturing relationship because their system has been conditioned to equate vulnerability with danger. They've spent years developing independence as a survival mechanism. Depending on someone feels foreign, sometimes even shameful. And even though they may long for connection, their reflex is to push it away the moment it feels too real. This internal conflict can be exhausting. On the one hand, they crave closeness. They want to feel loved, wanted, understood. But on the other hand, the very act of getting close makes them anxious, restless, sometimes even angry. So they live in a tug-of-war between desire and fear, and because this fear lives deep in the body, often beneath awareness, it's hard to put into words. But if they could speak from that hidden place, they'd say, "I want to let you in. I just don't know how to do that without losing myself. Avoidants often carry a secret longing that they rarely admit, not just to others, but even to themselves. It's the deep craving for love, for closeness, for connection that feels safe. But that longing is tangled with fear, because every time they've reached for it in the past, it came with a cost. Sometimes that cost was emotional overwhelm. Other times it was rejection, disappointment, or the feeling of being engulfed. Love for an avoidant is not simple. It's not a warm embrace they automatically lean into. It's a risk, a tightrope walk between wanting intimacy and fearing what it might take from them. This conflict between desire and self-protection isn't always visible from the outside. Avoidance can seem cool, composed, even indifferent. But behind that exterior is often a storm of feelings they don't know how to express or handle. They want to love and be loved. But love to them doesn't just mean connection. It means exposure. It means potentially having to rely on someone else. And when your life has taught you that dependence is dangerous or disappointing, letting someone in can feel like handing over control of your most vulnerable parts. This is why many avoidants are drawn to people who are emotionally available. But as soon as those people get close, the avoidant starts to feel the urge to pull away. It's not that they've lost interest. It's that they've hit the threshold of what their nervous system is comfortable with. The desire for love is still there, but it's buried under layers of anxiety, fear, and old wiring that equates closeness with the possibility of being hurt. If avoidants could speak without fear of judgment, they would admit how confusing it all is. They would tell you that they wake up missing someone but don't know how to reach out. That they crave the feeling of being held, of being understood. But that same craving feels dangerous. They want to be chosen, but fear the weight of being needed. They dream of a connection where they don't have to perform, where they don't have to constantly calculate how much of themselves is safe to share. But when that connection starts to form, the old alarms go off. The messages that were programmed into them long ago. Don't trust too much, don't depend, don't get too close, start to play in their mind again. And so they distance themselves, not because they want to leave, but because they don't know how to stay. Avoidants often wish they could love more freely, that they could lean in instead of pulling back, that they could express what's in their heart without fear that it will lead to disappointment, rejection, or a loss of control. But emotional intimacy requires a kind of surrender that feels unfamiliar and frightening. It means giving up some of the armor they've worn for years, maybe their whole life. And though they're often tired of being alone, they find a certain safety in solitude. There's no risk of being misunderstood when you're by yourself. No risk of being disappointed when no one else is involved. So they stay stuck between two opposing truths. They don't want to be alone, but they don't feel safe being fully connected either. This inner battle makes relationships with avoidance hard to navigate. Partners may feel confused by the mixed signals, one moment feeling close and connected, the next sensing the avoidant shutting down or pulling away. But that push-pull dynamic is a reflection of the emotional tug-of-war happening inside the avoidant. They don't want to lose you. They're just afraid of losing themselves. If they could speak clearly, they would say, "I'm afraid of needing you too much. I'm afraid that if I let you all the way in, I won't be able to protect myself, but I also don't want to go through life without love." These are not the words of someone who doesn't care. These are the silent confessions of someone who cares so much, they're paralyzed by the fear of what that caring could cost.